So we're going to talk about government ethics, not an oxymoron, right? Again, the roadmap for today, for those of you who are taking off the time, waiting to be out of here, is what is ethics generally. We're going to walk through kind of the big hot topics of conflicts of interest, nepotism, gifts, and outside employment. And then we're going to talk about some resources that are available for you. We're probably not going to talk a lot about the enforcement because that's going to take up a bunch of time, and I'm going to jump through that. And then we'll talk about some best practices that you can take away from today. So first, what is ethics? Thank you for reading my mind. I'm going to remember to cue you because I'm used to doing it myself. So ethics is obviously kind of the right and wrong question. What's the right thing to do? What is government ethics? Next slide, please. Is really knowing that you, in your capacity as a government employee, are held to a higher standard than members of the public. That just is the fact. When you're acting in your official capacity, your ethics are intended to be a higher standard, a higher bar. How do we know that? Because Oregon went through the trouble of adopting a whole body of law around ethics. It's codified. I brought it just in case anyone is really, really looking for something to help them sleep tonight. It's at Oregon Revised Statute 244, and it lays it out. And it's been revised a few times, so there's a couple updates that I want to get to today because I think it'll be new to you. So moving on, again, this addresses really those key topics that I mentioned and then some. We're not going to get into everything here, but there's your list of the things that this statute covers. Really, know, those of you who are in this room, this is going to apply to you, but public official means anyone who's elected or appointed to an office or position with a state, county, or city government, special district, as well as unpaid volunteers. That's something that not everybody realizes, particularly if they're appointed. Basically, the golden rule is you can't use or attempt to use your position, let me catch up with my own slides here, we're moving so fast, to obtain a financial gain or avoid a financial detriment for yourself, your relative, or a member of your household, or a business which you or a relative or a member of your household are associated, if the opportunity would not otherwise be available but for your position in office or your employment. We're going to be talking about all of the but-for examples there today. We can skip this one because we're going to develop it a little more next. So first I want to talk about conflicts of interest. Know that under the law, remember, it's intending to set a very high bar in this regard. So it deals with things where there is an actual conflict of interest as well as a potential conflict of interest. It's defined, both of those are defined in the statute. And so what it means is where some action that you're going to take would or may involve a potential benefit to you, that's where there's a conflict of interest. Again, because it also may involve relatives, I want to make sure that we know what that means. Seems obvious, but again, let's walk through it a little bit because it's a lot broader than some people sometimes think. It's the obvious things like a spouse, a parent, a step-parent, a child, a sibling, a step-sibling, a son-in-law, daughter-in-law. But it's also a spouse's parent, step-parent, child, sibling, step-sibling, son-in-law, or daughter-in-law, or anyone for whom you have a legal support obligation. So if you're raising someone else's children, or if you're taking care of maybe an elderly parent, that's when it's going to apply, even if it's not your own by blood. Also, anyone whom you provide benefits, whatever that means, right? Or for whom you get benefits. So anyone where there could be any really relationship that you rely on is going to be considered to be a relative for purposes of these statutes. We'll come back to that a few different ways, but I wanted to take a minute just to develop that a little bit. Okay, next slide, please. So, what's the difference between an actual conflict of interest and a potential conflict of interest? The difference between would and could. So an actual conflict of interest is where there is a known something would benefit you, you know it will benefit you or a relative or a member of your household. A potential conflict of interest, there's the potential for it to happen, but it's just a could. So what do you need to do? Well, key slide here, you just need to announce it, disclose it. What does that mean? Next slide. What it means is you've all seen your disclosure forms, right? Everybody familiar with your own policy on that. You have to tell the agency which employs you, the city, okay? So you have to describe the nature of the conflict of interest. That's for either an actual or a potential. That's the reason for those forms. For elected officials or appointed members of boards and commissions, that means you'll hear that sometimes in meetings where there's a disclosure during the meeting. That's why. That's what's required. It has to be publicly announced, needs to be on the record, and before any participation. There's a few caveats here, so let's move forward. So if it's a potential conflict of interest, meaning it only could create a conflict of interest, some decision, then the official may participate in the official action on the issue that's giving rise. They disclose, gosh, I'm concerned that I may have a conflict here, and things move forward. If it's an actual, gosh, I do have a conflict of interest here, they can't participate any further, with more exceptions to the exceptions in our next slide. So, exception there is if the vote is necessary for something to happen, then they can vote, but they can't participate in the discussion. So you'll see that happen. Again, they have to disclose it, and it's got to be on the record. Next slide, please. Great, thanks. The announcement needs to be made on occasion. So when there's you'll see that come up at each meeting. It's not just, oh gosh, I raised that a few months ago. You've got to raise it at each time. Same thing, for example, and this often comes up with our planning department employees. You have to give a written notice on each occasion where you participate in the action, right? That's why. When you're exempt from it is when there's something that basically you're in a class of citizens, essentially. An easy example of that I could come up with is a utility decision, right? You're going to be affected the same way as a majority of the public is. That's not necessarily a conflict. Gosh, I own a home. I'm concerned about making this decision. If you're kind of in a large category, probably not a conflict of interest. Let's see. Or you're on a board where your participation, let's think of our law enforcement officers, if they're on some body where they're making a decision related to law enforcement, and by nature of being on that board, they had to be a member of law enforcement. They don't have to disclose that because that was part of the prerequisite for being involved in that. Likewise, if you're involved in a tax-exempt organization, so a nonprofit. Okay. Nepotism, pretty simple here, and also I wanted to mention your city policies cover these. They're intended to provide you the safety net here, and I wanted to mention the number of the policy, and I thought I think it's 218, and I'd suggest you check it out when you're done here. This is a good time to refresh yourself on those. Short version, under the ethics laws, you can't participate in personnel actions. What does that mean? Appointing, employing, hiring, firing, promoting, those kinds of things of a relative. Remember, we define relative, and it's incredibly broadly. Same goes for supervising, with some exceptions. Particularly unpaid volunteers, you can supervise. Also, if it's consistent with the published policy, there are some special exceptions there for supervising. So, short version, no nepotism, although you can be employed together. Outside employment, again, the thought here, the reason behind this is not to use your public office for private gain. That's the whole purpose here. So you can't do anything for future employment. You can't use your city position to gain future employment. And the good news is the OGEC, the governing body over this, has published some take-home rules, which are our next slide. So they're guidelines. So don't work on if you have a business or an outside job, if it's permitted, don't do it on city time. Don't use city resources for any of those purposes. Obviously this is where it sort of also becomes a conflict of interest, this point 3. Don't use your position to take action that would advance this business interest or future employment. Next slide, please. And you obviously can't use confidential information or something you learn by virtue of your employment with the city in your private employment. So you can't start an endeavor because you know something may be happening that the rest of the public doesn't know. And same rules will apply for conflict of interest. So if you're participating in something, you have to follow the rules of disclosure for conflicts of interest. Pretty straightforward. Thanks for reading my mind on the slides. Gifts is where we're going to spend probably the bulk of our time. Obviously, this is kind of the key golden rule issue. You can't accept gifts because it creates the impression that you are acting for your own interest as opposed to the government interest, which is the #1 standard. But what does that mean? Remember, by the way, that prohibition extends to relatives or members of your household. So it's as well as businesses you may be involved with. It's not just what you accept. What does gift mean, though? It means something of economic value given to a public official or a relative or member of the household without valuable consideration of equivalent value. You're not paying for it, it's free, or it's discounted in some way, including the full or partial forgiveness of indebtedness, which is not extended to others who are not public officials or relatives or members of the household on the same terms and conditions, or for valuable consideration less than that required from others who are not. Pretty straightforward, right? It does not include, and this is where there's almost more exceptions than there are rules on this one, it doesn't mean your compensation package. We'll talk about some examples of that. It doesn't mean if you're asked to speak and you get an honorarium, again, provided it's within the guidelines there, which is the $50 limit, plaques, certificates, those kinds of things. It does not mean that. It does not mean reimbursement of expenses, again, provided they're within the guidelines. It doesn't mean unsolicited awards for professional achievement. We all want those. It doesn't mean things that we're going to define this exception here in a minute, which is why it's asterisked there. Limit within the gift limits, $50 is the spoiler alert, but we'll get there. And it doesn't mean gifts received from a source that could not reasonably be known to have a legislative or administrative interest. That's clear as mud, right? We'll talk about that more in a second. And it doesn't mean receipt of any item that is excluded from this list. Keep going, because that keeps going on here. So let's talk about what the gift limits are first before we get into those other exceptions. Again, the key here is highlighted for you. Really, we're talking about $50 is the value from a single source. We're going to talk about what that means. That could reasonably known to have a legislative or administrative interest in the city, in which you make a decision. We're going to define those things. So let's move forward. So source. You need to know the source. OGEC says you really need to know two things. If you get something free, you need to know where it came from, and you need to know whether the dollar limit is acceptable if you want to be able to assess this. So know the source. Once you know the source, what you need to figure out is, does it have a legislative or administrative interest? What that means is an economic interest different from the general public that is on any matter subject to the decision or vote of the public official in acting in the public official's capacity as a public official. Right? So any decision that you make may impact this source in your official capacity. Or any matter, if decided or voted, or a vote of the candidate who, if elected, this is dealing with candidate stuff. So move forward. So decision, that means an act that commits the public body to something. So I'm going to be approving a contract. That's a decision. What it's not is sort of a recommendation for work performed in an advisory capacity. So, gosh, I think we should use this agency, I think they're really good. That's a little bit different than if you're not the decision maker. Gosh, I really like this vendor for things. I use them a lot, that kind of thing. Here's an example. Permits, arrests, citations, that kind of thing. Contracts, purchasing decisions, obviously. Also know, this last one is important, even if you delegate the decision making to somebody else, you now have two people in that chain of decision making. It's not that you can say you don't do it anymore. If you have delegated that, you're still the decision maker, and now the other person is as well. So both of you are in that line of consideration on that. Continuing the exceptions here, it also doesn't include, this is obviously important for candidates, campaign contributions, as long as they're within the campaign, the limits of the statute. Contributions to a legal expense trust fund. Gifts from relatives or member of the public official's household, thank goodness, right? Publication, subscriptions, or other informational materials related to your duties. So as long as it's part of your training or ongoing education, you're okay. Waivers or discounts for registrations of materials relating to continuing ed. Same thing if it's for licensing. Keep moving for me, thank you so much. Okay, this is where I want to walk through these specifically just because I understand this is where things can get a little thorny. So entertainment, travel, lodging, those kinds of things, this is what we're going to be talking about here. So it is not included if it's, or not prohibited, if it's entertainment for you or a relative. It's incidental to the main purpose of the event. So if you go to a training, a conference, or some sort of public event, and there's takeaway gifts, that's okay. Entertainment for you or a relative, when you're representing for a ceremonial purpose. So if you go to some event as a member of the representing the city, it's okay. Food, beverage, admission for you, a member of your household or staff, when you're scheduled to speak or answer questions at a reception, meal, or meeting of the city. Food or beverage consumed at a reception where the food and beverage is incidental part of the reception and there was no admission charged. So those wonderful cold chicken dinners, not a gift in many ways. Also, not when you're traveling, and this includes relatives if they're traveling with you, again, consistent with policy, when it's paid by another public official. Maybe there's two, there's an event where you're going with other city employees and you guys are all going to a conference together. That's okay too. Food, lodging, or travel. If you're scheduled to speak, make a presentation, participate on a panel, or represent a government agency at a convention, fact-finding trip, or other meeting. So things where there's an official component to your travel, food, lodging, takeaways from those things, typically okay. Same thing here. As long as it's part of representing the city and it's officially sanctioned, typically it's not included in the gift limitations. Just again, this is how deep the statutes get into food and beverage. We're still going. Also allowed when it's associated with a financial transaction or business agreement. So if you're engaging in some sort of a meeting to evaluate contracts, that kind of thing, also not considered a gift if the person you're meeting with picks up the tab, typically. Okay, so what's the guideline here? Here's your checklist. This is your takeaway. Am I a public official? Spoiler alert. If you're in this room, the answer is yes. Okay. So now, know the source, right? Figure out the source of the gift. Does that source have a legislative or administrative interest? Is there something that they're going to benefit from based on my decision-making ability? Again, here's how that works out. Do they have an economic interest distinct from that of the general public? Is there something of economic value that they're giving you? Is it within the limitations? And does an exception apply? That's your checklist for going through whether you need to be returning it or not accepting it, obviously. Okay, a few ways that has revealed itself, watching my time here. Okay. There have been a few decisions around some of the subtleties here that I wanted to make sure you knew. So things like when things could otherwise be considered potentially a gift or a benefit of some kind, if it's part of your compensation package, you're also okay. That would be personal cell or telephone service. If you get a special rate because you're a city employee, potentially there have been decisions that said that is okay. Same thing where if you're, again, subject to policy, we're talking about the law here as opposed to your city's policy, but use of the city vehicle for incidental personal use, that's okay if it's permitted. And here was the one surprised me, frankly, that it was such a big hot button issue was, what about all my travel miles if I'm using my government card? Do I get to keep the miles, or do we have to pool them, give them the city to figure out what to do with? Good news, you can keep them. It's part of the compensation package, again, assuming you have them. So, okay, enforcement. I'm going to go ahead and do these despite what I told you. The reason why we're talking about this, the reason why you're going to periodically be talking about this is the sort of the scary part of the conversation, is these are individual responsibilities to know these rules. This is your individual responsibility to follow these, follow the law here. The penalties follow you, and the city has policies to try to help guide that compliance, of course. But these are your responsibilities to follow. What happens is, this is the worst case scenario here, is civil penalties are imposed. And they can be incredibly significant. Up to $5,000 for a violation. That was increased to $10,000 if there's a determination made that you violated it on a willful basis, which in my experience is a pretty low standard in application. If you should have known the rule and you did it anyway, that's considered willful. Also, additional penalties for things like public meetings, executive session rules, and late filing penalties for failure to file a statement of economic interest. So those disclosure of those potential conflicts and economic interests have their own set of penalties. In addition, if you receive something of value, that's its own level of penalty here. Double the amount you can be charged with paying. So real reason to sit up and take notice of these things. So who enforces this? The Oregon Government Ethics Commission, OGEC. They also, fortunately, and I think it's really handy, so one thing I didn't bring, they have a handbook, a little pamphlet that has all of these guidelines included in it. It's online. I know you have copies here. It's an incredible resource for you. Covers all of this stuff and more. So they do that. They do training, but they also do the enforcement. And how does that work? Also they offer guidance. Anybody here called? They have a hotline. Yeah. They offer informal guidance. They also offer formal guidance. I know that that has been obtained too. 3 types. The first 2, staff advice and staff advisory opinions, are helpful. They're not as protective if you rely on them as the third, which is the commission advisory opinion. So that tends to be why, if there's when in doubt, folks go with the third option. But it certainly never hurts to call that number and just get an initial read on things too. So how do you request it? Well, again, you can get the informal, the first one there, the staff advice. You can do it by phone, by email, in person. You can ask, and you'll get that advice. You can go to the second level, which is a letter, and you'll get advice that way. Or you can, again, go to the third one, which is the much more formal that goes through the full commission and is vetted. Lots of options to you there. Certainly always advisable to request. When in doubt, ask. And again, those first 2, will be, if you relied on advice, it'll be used when they consider the penalty phase, provided you disclosed all of the facts and you relied on the actual advice they gave you. Often that will mitigate the penalties, but it's not a total defense. When you get to the formal commission opinion, you actually get a total defense on those. So that's, again, why that avenue is a preferred path. Okay, next slide, please. Yeah, thank you. Okay, so what happens if somebody files a complaint about you? They think you've engaged in wrongful conduct under this? Well, the commission has a process for it, and I'm going to whiz through these really quick for in the interest of time. First, they review it. This is the confidential part of the process. They review it and decide. You also get notice about it at this stage, whether there's cause to proceed further. If they determine that there's cause, next slide, please. If they determine that there's cause, they go ahead and do a formal investigation. They're permitted 6 months to do that. It can be extended. And then next step, please. Then they make a decision. There's a recommendation. The commission meets and reviews the report from the director and considers whether they want to extend it. They want to decide that they're going to proceed with an action, or if they want to negotiate a resolution. And then you get into a contested action proceeding. They think that there was wrongful conduct. You didn't resolve it. You're going to go into a full sort of mini trial process, which is a separate subject, but that's the process for that. So, best practices. Big takeaway here is perception is reality. That's really the big takeaway from this. The expectation imposed by the law and the impressions of society is when you're acting in your official capacity, you're not going to be acting with self-interest. You're not going to be acting to benefit yourself. You're not going to be acting to benefit a member of your household. You're going to be acting purely for the benefit of the city. So if you make a misstep, unfortunately, that's a misstep that's perceived by the city generally. So act with all caution and keep the bar very high for yourself there. So I've mentioned this for those of you who've been to any of the harassment trainings we've done. I've used the example of when thinking about communication and whether you'd be comfortable with seeing it blown up this big sitting in front of it. Same rule applies here. Is this the kind of thing you'd want reported in the media or blown up on the wall and you'd be standing in front of it? Those are the kinds of considerations you want to do. What's the perspective? Again, perception can be reality. Think about how the perception can fuel people's impression about your appropriate behavior as a representative of the city. Really pretty common sense stuff, but something it's a good time to kind of slow down, remind yourself of those expectations, refresh yourself on those rules, gifts, conflict of interest, and you'll keep the bar in the right place. Okay. When in doubt, here's the resources. Again, lots of ways to get opinions on this. Consult the guidelines. Your own policies set the bar even higher for good reason. But there's a hotline for you. And again, big takeaway here is this is a good thing to remind yourself of periodically. It's easy to get think that you know the expectations or get used to acting one way. These are the kinds of things, particularly to avoid those willful standard violations. You want to make sure you're refreshing yourself on this and check your city policies cover this stuff. I think I may have abbreviated myself and done it on time. That's all.